Professor PLO Lumumba is a Kenyan legal scholar, anti-corruption crusader, and one of Africa's most influential public intellectuals. He is in Zambia for a private engagement. Now, while here, we take opportunity to explore some of the most pressing issues shaping the continent today. Constitutional reforms across African governments, Zambia's path to the 2026 elections, Tanzania's disputed vote, Kenya after the death of Raila Odinga, the rise of military governments in West Africa, instability in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Africa's evolving relationship with the United States under the administration of President Donald Trump. Welcome to this very special interview in Costa's cross-examination. I have the opportunity and privilege of speaking to Professor PLO Lumumba, who's my guest on this interview. Prof, welcome, and it's a pleasure to host you in our studios.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
I think there are quite a number of issues, really, when you look at Africa, and it's very difficult where to start from. But I think let's start with what one may describe as the global geopolitics and dynamics of what is happening in the world right now. I like to call it probably a second scramble for Africa, yes. Where now we see the BRICS shaping up in a different aspect. We did see a solidarity of China, Korea, India, and Brazil, Russia meeting on the global stage in Russia, while the usual Western powers, as they are known, the superpowers, seem to be crumbling a bit, with Europe having its own internal problems, the USA pulling out of Africa. How should Africa be positioning in itself in this whole context of geopolitical dynamics?
You are right in saying that this is indeed a latter-day scramble for Africa. And this must be understood in the context of the changing dynamics in the world. The United Nations, as the hegemon militarily and economically, is no longer in that space as firmly as it should. And you can see what one may call a civil war within the conceptual West, the pulling and pushing of Europe and the United States of America. At the same time, there is an emerging China, which is moving in a subterranean way. There is also the emergence of other players in different ways. The Arabs are doing their thing with a view to influencing processes in Africa. The Russians are also trying to reassert themselves. The Indians, and then, of course, the formation of the BRICS, which is meant to be a counterweight to the Bretton Woods institutions, to mean the IMF and the World Bank. Unfortunately, once again, the continent of Africa is at its weakest in terms of her inability to speak with one voice and therefore to offer strength. If you look at African institutions, whether they are regional economic communities, and I'm talking about SADC, ECOWAS, the East African Community, and the Central African Organization, they are weak. And if you look at the African Union, it is weak. And because of that, it is easy to manipulate and to divide Africans. And that is why you see everybody is coming into the continent, and Africans are working at cross purposes. In the very same way that African countries did in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you can see that this scramble is very coordinated. It's coordinated with different agenda. The United States of America government summons African leaders. The Japanese do so. The Chinese do so. The Russians do so. The Qataris do so. The Italians do so. The European Union do so. And we are playing as if we do not know what the game in town is.
But if we're being summoned, yes, Professor, it means we've got something to offer. It means there's something attractive about us.
Oh, there's always been something attractive about the continent of Africa. Her resources. During the days of slavery, it is Africans themselves who are commodified and were resources. Then our minerals became useful. then our minerals are acquiring an even greater significance now that we are talking about artificial intelligence, and you look at the resources, whether it's uranium or cobalt or rare earth. That is why we are being summoned. But why should we be summoned? If we were coordinated, we would be trading. If we were coordinated, we would be speaking with one voice. If we were coordinated, we would not allow ourselves to be dealt with as Zambia, as Kenya, as Zimbabwe. We would say, deal with Africa with one voice. Come to Addis Ababa and deal with us.
What then makes us weak for many countries 60, 70 years after independence, highly educated individuals, professors like yourselves, lawyers and so on, who understand that our biggest value is our resource, and this is where we have the biggest talk or bite on the table? Why have we lost that patriotism? Why have we lost that venom that the forefathers of Nyerere and Nkrumah and Kaunda had?
You know, at the risk of irritating and annoying many, I think we have dual problem. A dual problem of the people of Africa and those who call themselves the leaders. Because voters in Africa have the penchant for putting in office men and women who have minimal interest in the long-term interest of Africa, we then have leaders in many countries who are prepared to sell their countries for a song. They are prepared to be manipulated. And I want to say many of these leaders have low self-esteem. They are intimidated when they attend conferences outside of the country. They are intimidated and talked down to. And because their economies are weak, they are susceptible to manipulation. And that is why individuals like Nkrumah, like Nyerere, like Kenneth David Kaunda said very early on in the 1960s, beware of the neocolonial project. What is the neocolonial project? The continuation of colonialism by other means. So you have this crown jewel, which is apparent political independence, but the economic jewels have been removed. You are inheriting a system of governance which was created for purposes of supporting a colonial system. You've never changed it fundamentally. You don't understand it.
So we don't own the economy.
We don't own the economies. If you look at the economy of almost 90% of African countries, they are dominated from outside. We do not control the dynamics. If you look at the financial sector, you don't control it. Your currencies are next to nothing in terms of their value. The economic fundamentals are dictated from outside. And these are the things that we ought to focus on if we are to regain economic independence and therefore have both the wherewithal to confront these latter-day colonialists and latter-day economic parasites who come to Africa for the single reason of taking Africa's resources. Are we ready and willing to do so? On the basis of the evidence available, we are half-hearted.
Some may feel that Africa's new leaders have reached a cusp of doing exactly just that, pushing back and taking back what is theirs. In Kenya, President William Ruto has been very loud on talking against an anti-dollarism on the issue of the currency that you talk about. Again, is there a possibility, people like late Gaddafi tried this, to have an amalgamated United States of Africa and probably one currency, probably not really in the offing soon. Just this week, Professor, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has been, pushing for the G20, that's the world's most powerful nations, to host its summit in Africa. First, we want to see, there's been a pushback. President Donald Trump even saying they will shun it if it happens in Africa. Burkina Faso with young Traore talking about having non-raw materials going out of Africa. We've seen that happening in Namibia and certain pronouncements happening within Rwanda. Does Africa have the right leaders with some of these examples that I'm giving?
When you give those examples, I'm taken aback, except for very few. And let us distinguish the rhetoric from action. People say very good things when they go to international conferences and they make many pronouncements, but let's judge people on the basis of action. If you look at the East African community, for example, the Kenyan president that you have talked about is the chair of the East African community. Kenya is holding the secretariat of the East African community. We had fast tracking of political federation being proposed as early as 2004. We were to have a single currency. We were to have one president by the year 2010. We've got to harmonize. We said we would harmonize our customs union and our common market, but go to the ground. The opposite is the reality. We are saying the right things and doing the wrong things. Come to SADC, the same thing. And if you go to ECOWAS, it is similar disorganization. Central Africa, similar disorganization. Come to the African Union and you talk about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers. There are tariff barriers. We said that we would have a common airspace as early as 1988 in Yamoussoukro in Burkina Faso, rather Yamoussoukro in La Côte d'Ivoire. We said that we would have free movement of people. We are still using passports. So the rhetoric that you hear from African heads of states and government and ministers as compared to the action on the ground are worlds apart. The time is now to begin to act. And that is why we must go back to the basics. If you look at some of the individuals who are there in the first years of independence, there was not communication like we have today. But listen to what they were doing and see what they were doing. See what Kaunda was trying to do, what Nyerere was trying to do, what Nkrumah was trying to do, what all these individuals were trying to do. They had confidence and they had self-respect. Of course, it cannot be said that it's all doom and gloom. There are things that are happening. In Rwanda, there is an attempt to do something, but too small an economy to have an impact that we desire. If you go to Burkina Faso, the Burkina Faso economy is a small one. It's not more than 25 billion United States of America. So the actions of taking out some of the French influence is commendable. But is it coordinated? Can it resist France and the European Union? Can it resist the pushback by these neocolonialists? No, it can't. The only way that we can do so is to work in a coordinated fashion. You imagine for 1 minute that SADC had one common foreign policy, one economic agenda. Budgets were read and coordinated on the same day in all SADC countries and in ECOWAS and East African Community, that there was a single currency. It would be a totally different kettle of fish.
You have participated in some of these initiatives, like you've rightfully put it, in the early 2000s on the East African Community. You've written concepts on this to have one president, one currency, UNCTAD, SADC, and all these. We've known this, but where is then the problem? Because, like you rightly said, history, the colonialists came and divided us with these illusionary boundaries called, borders. We are being told we are the fastest growing continent in the world, with the youngest population, with all the mineral resources, with over 1.4 billion people to internally trade. But we seem not to be doing so well in terms of intra-Africa trade. Where then lies the bigger problem as to why we have been failing to achieve even just a regional economic motivated pathway to this economic liberation?
The problems are multiple. Number one, it is at the level of political leadership. That is where the problem is. Number two, economic fundamentals. We are still prisoners of an economic system that we do not understand. Zambia's Dambisa Moyo has written books on this. She's written Dead Aid. African economies are still being dictated to by IMF and World Bank. And if you look at many countries, you'll go to ministers of finance or governors of central bank in many African countries, somehow had their training in the World Bank, and they don't know better. Theirs is increase taxes, borrow more, and reduce this or that. They don't know. In other words, they are running things that they don't understand. We've got to have an economic model that we understand. Has it been done elsewhere? Yes, it has. Look at the way the Japanese run their economies, the South Koreans running their economy, the Vietnamese run their economy, the Indonesians are running their economy. But when you come to Africa, World Bank officials are like demigods. They come and meet your presidents and almost talk down to your presidents. And in that way, they control not only your economy, but your monetary policy. They tell you, devalue the kwacha, devalue the kwanza, devalue the shilling. And we follow them as if we do not know what to do.
But we live in a global village, and you've given these good examples of what we're now referring to as tiger economies. Let's take Singapore, Malaysia, for example. Lee Kuan Yew has written so many books, and if you look at many African economies at the point of independence, more powerful, more stable than South Korea, more stable than Singapore. How have they done it? Why can't we learn? This is a global example.
We should. And indeed, I hear quite a number of African leaders saying we want to move from the first to from the third to the first world. But if you are driving in the wrong direction and you are moving at jet-like speed, you'll never reach your decision. And that is the problem in many African countries. The basic question that individuals like Lee Kuan Yew asked is, what is good for Singapore? How can we do it from a Singaporean perspective? By borrowing international best practices, adopting them and adapting them. That is why the Chinese, for example, perhaps too big to be a good example for most of Africa, but they say democracy with Chinese character. So that when we are talking about things and we say in Zambia we want to change the economy, what are we borrowing and giving it the Zambian character? What are we doing in agriculture? What are we doing in mining? What are we doing in technology? And how are we conducting our politics in a manner that creates an enabling environment? These are the critical things that we should talk about. You go to many African countries, you have problem with fuel. And yet the neighboring country is fuel producing. You go to the next country, there is a shortage of maize. Yet the neighboring country is producing excess maize. Lack of coordination. And all these things we recognized in the 1960s. In 1980, African heads of states and governments sat in Lagos and came with the Lagos Plan of Action on how we ought to do it. In 2013, we sat down in Addis Ababa and said how it should be. So the African problem is also implementation. It's not that we do not know what ought to be done. We do. But we choose not to.
We'll have too many meetings. But there's another school of thought, Professor. I'm happy that you've mentioned democracy, but in a Chinese version. And the West may call it communism. But I think what I see in the South Asia Pacific is that they are more committed as a people, as a nation, towards development rather than internal politics. Has this so-called culture of democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of association, come too early for Africa?
No,
that it distracts us from economic development?
No, in the 1960s, a similar question was asked of Haile Selassie, and he said, when we say it has come too early, suggesting that Africans were created later than everybody else. No. Remember that the post-colonial African state is a creation of the colonialists. So we labor from that burden. We labor from systems of governance that are alien. We've tried to make the best of them, but to a large extent, we are still dictated to. If you look at former British colonies, we want to behave as if we are a mirror of the United Kingdom, our parliamentary system, our judicial system, our common systems. We even are members of the Commonwealth of Independent Nations, and periodically we are told that this is not in keeping with the Commonwealth spirit. What is Commonwealth spirit other than a neocolonial spirit? It is time now that African countries must rethink governance. When we talk democracy, who defines that democracy? If you have an election in any African country, you'll have observers from the European Union, observers from the Commonwealth, observers from SADC, observers from everywhere. But Africans are waiting. What have the British said? Is it good? When they say it is good, then we, even the newspapers say,
that's the standard.
This is the gold standard. Our low self-esteem as a people is also part of our problem. And the time is now that we must rethink governance. The Southeast Asian that you are talking about, the South Koreans, a little country that at independence had a weaker economy than Zambia, Kenya, and many African countries, what did they do? Adopted a system of governance infused with certain Korean characteristics. Then they went into the space of technology. Then every politician was made to believe that we may be on opposite sides in terms of perspectives, but ultimately we are Koreans, and we are doing things from a Korean perspective. Come to African countries. The quest for public office is cutthroat competition, and throats are sometimes cut. How do we mobilize ourselves along primordial ethnic instincts? And we want to succeed in the 21st century? We cannot succeed unless we realize that we are in a totally different space. And that is why Samora famously said, for the modern post-colonial African country to succeed, the tribe must die. And what did he mean? That you can retain your tribes. You can celebrate your culture. But when it comes to building Zambia, building Mozambique, we cannot talk about the language of the tribe.
You talk about the destruction of internal, politics, and one big problem we see it here even in Zambia, but across Africa, is the lack of developmental continuity of policy and structure. So coming one party, an election into another, and another president, this one is being followed after they were in office, they're being arrested, and projects and all. So there's lack of continuity. Moving away from the Southeast Pacific, another model example to look at is the Middle East. Qatar now, Dubai, the Arab Emirates. And even amidst the climate change debate and COP30 going on in Brazil, they realize that they're endowed with oil, and that's their only cash cow. And they said this we will hold on to despite having monarchies, but they stick on the agenda of development. Dubai, a desert, but a big global powerhouse.
In our lifetime, it is about the ability to recognize what you have and using it to good effect for the general good. You've given a perfect example. Dubai, the Emiratis, just 30 years ago, these were deserts. What did they do? We have oil. We are going to use it to change the lives of our people. If we need human resource, we'll import it. Kuwait, the same thing. Qatar, the same thing. Brunei, the same thing. Bahrain, the same thing. Muscat in Oman, the same thing. And if you look at the resources that we have in many African countries, our economies are more diversified in terms of resource base. But we don't use them to that effect. And once again, it is the quality of political leadership. In many African countries, a new leader tries to obliterate the legacy of the predecessor. Of what value? When you started constructing a road in one political dispensation, there is no political badge for that road. Africans just want road. If I want a road from Lusaka to Ndola, I just want a road. In any event, you are using the taxes of the people. So we must liberate ourselves from this kind of thinking. We must exercise the ghost of narrowness and short-sightedness, political myopia. Once we do that, the persons who leave office will say what Nyerere used to say, that you are not successful until your successor succeeds.
You've had the privilege, Professor Lumumba, to sit, meet, advise and whisper to some of these, presidents in Africa, and some of them seemingly you have publicly, supported them in terms of their visions and so on, but others begin to change along the way, become monsters or shadows of themselves, demigods within the aspect of prolonged constitutionalism, becoming long life leaders. What do you think is the problem in Africa. Let's start, for example, you have in East Africa, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni in Uganda. He's been in power since 87. In Zambia, would say Wamuyaya, lifelong. Kagame, the issues in Rwanda that Rwanda is probably not thinking beyond Kagame. They believe he should never die. They believe nobody should take over after him. To the contrary, another dynamic, you were so upbeat about Lazarus Chakwera in Malawi.
Yes, I was.
And he has been booted out as a one-term, president. So Africa is so dynamic. But let's talk about the old guards, like the Musevenis, the Kagames now, who are being looked at as life presidents of these economies.
It pains me, particularly for those whom we thought were on the right trajectory. President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, whose songs of praise I used to sing in the first 10 years, say this man stabilized Uganda, this man and his administration was moving in the right direction. Then there comes a time when, through influence that I do not understand, then people don't want to leave office. And what that does is creates personality cultism. What that does is that it weakens institutions. And when institutions are weak, it means that beyond that powerful leader, the things that he presided over may very well crumble. President Kagame took over in 1994 after a very painful genocide. And I'm happy to know now that he said that this is his last term, and I pray that it is. Because if it is, his duty now is to midwife succession, so that he himself would say, like Nyerere used to say and told me when I served as an intern in his foundation, that one of my greatest desires is, my greatest desire was and is for me to live as a citizen of Tanzania when I'm not the president.
But sadly, Professor, most of our leaders, when they start off good, are not very good at becoming midwives to birth continuation on leadership.
It is sad, and that is why I hope, therefore, that President Kagame will see this. President Museveni is going through an election in 2026, is given, he's going to win it, and I hope that that will truly be his final term, so that he begins to midwife a process that will lead to leadership that is more institutionally based.
Why is it so difficult for Africa? I mean, despite the fact that we're saying we need to create our own democratic jurisdictions that mirror to our culture, why is it difficult to see continuity? In other jurisdictions, you even know that after this prime minister or president, this one is scheduled to take over. Unfortunately, you can't see or point to Uganda to say, could it be, or probably the son to Museveni. In Rwanda, it's even unthinkable to start talking about a successor.
People blame, they say, people around him. I never buy that it is the people around you who... You've got to make a decision that is firm and clear. Talk to people like Nyerere. They will tell there was no shortage of people who are telling him to go on. It is you who must know that this is a relay race. And you don't even have to know who will be the successor. This is not a kingdom. These are not kingdoms. You create systems that will give birth to individuals. In Tanzania, for example, who knew Mwinyi would be the leader? The system produced Mwinyi. Who knew Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete would be the leader? The system did. The system produced Mkapa. The system produced Magufuli. That is the kind of system that one desires. In South Africa also, though the ANC is weakening by the day, we knew after Mandela, who knew that Mbeki would be the president? Who knew Zuma and Cyril? There is a system that produces, and the same too in Namibia. After Nyoma, we knew the Kipunye Pohamba, and also in Botswana. So we must not speak as if there are no systems in all African countries. There are countries which have demonstrated that it can be done. Ghana has done so in the recent past. Nigeria may have its problems since then, but after the 1967 Civil War and the 1979 Obasanjo move into civilian, with their problems, they have done so. What we need to do is to make sure that these good examples are the rule rather than the exception.
If things are performing well, the economy, the people's livelihood and so on, is it wrong for people then to feel or do what, for example, the Chinese have done under when they recently held earlier this year the Communist Party Congress, and they elected Xi Jinping as a lifelong leader?
You know, these matters of leadership are culturally founded. You must not do what China is doing because it is working for China. What works in China may not work in Zambia or in Kenya or in Mozambique. You've got to create your own unique culture that defines how leaders come and go. And if you look at China, it has a history of having leaders who stay in power, from Mao to Deng, and now we see Xi. That is the path that they have chosen. We must choose our path that works. And that path must be defined by a people reading from the same page. The problem in Africa is thinking in silos, and then having fidelity to the things we call parties, which have no ideological anchors. They are just organizations and machines for elections. A political party is ideologically grounded on critical issues that affect the country and the economy, on agriculture, on health, on the economy, on technology, on how to deal with issues of disadvantaged segments of the society like youth and women. And these are the things that ought to be articulated. When you look at your typical African political party in many countries, they are not possessed of those fundamentals, which calls into question, are we mimicking systems that we do not understand? John Henry Clark, whom I love quoting, that great American, once said that African countries, when they regained independence, did so on the basis of systems of governance borrowed from their former colonizers, and none of them will ever succeed on the basis of those systems. And if you see what is happening in Africa, a country appears to be moving very well, then in the twinkling of an eye, all the gains that were made are completely whitewashed.
Just on that score, and earlier on you did talk about a system that happened in Tanzania, from Nyerere through into Kikwete, Mkapa, Ali Mwinyi, and them. Tanzania just recently had, an election, which many say have disputed, and you've questioned who declares, this standard. Is Tanzania in trouble? And I know it's been Chama Pinduzi from at the helm since independence. Is Tanzania in trouble based on democratic values and tenets with the recent election?
Two things. Let me first of all say that Tanzania started as Tanganyika, formed Tanzania with Afro Shirazi and TANU to become CCM in 1977, and that CCM has been power from that day. And we've seen what was very respectable succession, from Nyerere to Mwinyi, from Mwinyi to Mkapa, from Mkapa to Kikwete, from Kikwete to Magufuli, and then upon his death to Samia Suluhu Hassan. And to Tanzania's credit, even when the wave of multi-partyism came to Africa, Nyerere was one of the first leaders to see it very quickly and to allow multi-partyism. And now what has happened in Tanzania must also be seen in the context of a new wave. There is new thinking across Africa, young, impatient leaders or impatient population that wants things done properly. And the mistake, in my view, that was made in Tanzania was the intolerance that crept in, with those in administration charging leading political individuals with the offense of treason. We may not know the details, but once you charge people with treason in circumstances where the evidence is not a smoking gun, you are seen to be simply trying to eliminate credible opposition. When you bar a candidate on the eve of the election, you are seen to be paving your path to victory and to make it easy. And when on the day of the election, young people come out and disrupt the electoral process in critical areas, even when your win is legitimate, it is questioned. So it is the duty of the administration in Tanzania, which goes into this new era of the election in a very troubled way, so that some have questioned. They say the election is not legitimate, the president is not legitimate, and that is not a good space to be in.
So then how does the continent proceed then in terms of these bilateral relations? I mean, SADC and others have called this election a sham. Our very own president here, President Hichilema, attended the inauguration, which other presidents shunned. How then does Africa begin to look at one another in terms of these, democratic...
African countries must be bold enough.
Or we are being hypocritical?
We must not be hypocritical. We must be bold enough to tell our colleagues, if you love your neighbor and you love the thing that they are doing, when their house is on fire, you tell them your house is on fire, and you help them to put the fire down. You don't pretend that there is no fire. So in the case of the Tanzanian election, people should be bold enough to say, yes, we know you have now presented the country with a fait accompli. There is no possibility of the re-election being held. But take this opportunity to address the problems that were being raised. Number one, release everybody who was imprisoned on the basis of politics. Two, ensure that you set up a commission to investigate what happened and populate that commission with people who are capable of being neutral, even if you have to borrow them from SADC and the East African community. Once you do that, in the case of Tanzania, there had been a call for a new constitutional dispensation. Have an all-Tanzanian meeting at which all political parties are called, the civil society is called, the religious bodies are called, and all critical people in the society, so that you may talk about the future of Tanzania going forward. When you do that, you blunt the edges of the sword of dissatisfaction. If you don't, then you are sitting on a volcano.
Do you see this happening under President Samia Suluhu, or have we started noticing dictatorship tendencies in a woman that many thought was probably finishing a term of late Magufuli successfully? Is she now beginning to stamp her own terms of authority?
I've started seeing signs of positive change. When I listened to her addressing the parliament on 14th day of November 2025, and she apologized, that was a good sign. When she said that she's directing the Director of Public Prosecution to look at the charges against young people with a view to withdrawing them, that was a good thing. But I want to see the big one. I want to see the pronouncement that Tundu Lissu, who is the leading opposition leader charged with treason, is also released. And I would love to see Tundu released, and he too must also think beyond himself and think Tanzania. And I want to see a meeting between the two of them and all the opposition political parties. I want them to talk about constitutional dispensation. If she continues on the path that she talked about on the 14th day of November and continues on that trajectory, history may be kinder to her.
I want very quickly for us to touch on internal happenings in Zambia, but I would like to give what is happening here to a bit of a regional and African context. It's the participation of former heads of state in what, quote-unquote, active politics of their country. We really believe in Africa that a former head of state must graduate into being a statesman, become a diplomat, just go for election observation and so on. But we've seen, well, on the global stage, Trump getting out of office, bouncing back into office. Ian Khama went into exile into South Africa. He came supporting new politics within Botswana, and an election of Boko Duma happened. Duma Boko rather happened. We've seen it elsewhere with former presidents playing a role. In Zambia, sadly, we had only one surviving sixth head of state in Edgar Lungu, who said he had retired, then wanted to come back into active politics because he believed that his successor and the party in power, the UPND, were decimating the former ruling party, the PF. Professor, it's a very unfortunate scenario for Zambia right now. It's over 5 months. Edgar Lungu died on June 5 in South Africa, 2025. His body has not been returned to Zambia. His political party that he stood on, the PF, that was the former ruling party, is in shambles right now. People do not know whether this largest opposition on paper will participate in an election 8 months, from now. Hakainde Hichilema, who you've also, written or spoken about, came and was voted with high hopes. 1 million young Zambians putting him into power. Some feel he's leading with a heavy hand, arresting opposition political opponents through the crusade of corruption, fighting for a constitutional change and increasing the number of members of parliament and making a few amendments to the constitution. How do you look at this scenario for Zambia and Africa?
Let me say this. When you talk about Africa, we must remember that we are still divided into these little countries, and each country's political culture determines and dictates how politics is to be conducted. If the political culture in a country is of such a nature that there is sobriety, so that when a leader leaves office, they are treated with dignity, if they themselves behaved with dignity when they were in office, that is critical. If they did not behave with dignity when they were in office, if, for example, they were thieves, they must be dealt with as thieves. But if they were not thieves, there are certain sins that can't be forgiven. But if they were looters and they looted in a manner that affected the country, then the law must be allowed to take its own course. But if they are good, they did the right thing, then they become advisors. I'll mention Julius Nyerere ad nauseum. When he left office, he was the statesman to whom everybody went, including the opposition, because he could tell you, I did not steal a single cent from Tanzania. That is the kind of leadership that deserves to be treated in a manner that is dignified. But if you have a leader who, upon leaving office, is in the habit of trying to undermine his or a successor, then there will be pushback. And that calls into question the political culture in a particular country. When you leave office, as I said a little earlier, it is your duty that your successor succeeds, because leadership of the political kind or any kind is a relay race. The projects that started during your term will be concluded during the term of another. Because if you are dealing with projects like roads, they cannot be concluded during one term. It's a continuity. And what we are therefore seeing as politicians trying to interfere in elections after they leave office is because those in office and they themselves have created a culture that does not allow for calm and quiet to reign. These are indictments of how we conduct our politics. And that does not only include the political leadership. It includes the intellectuals. It includes everybody. All of us have sinned and fallen short of the expectations of our countries. So finger pointing must be limited, because ultimately we all follow sink.
Zambia has been known and described by many as a beacon of peace and hope. Landmark achievements and milestones for Africa happening in Lusaka. For example, the change of the name from OAU to AU happened in Lusaka. We've brokered peace talks between, Savimbi and UNITA rebels in Angola, the DRC, Kabila, and all of those. And obviously this transition of power successfully to have 7 different presidents, since, KK. How does it make you feel as a Pan-Africanist yourself to see what is happening now that you've got a body of Edgar Lungu? We can't even say may his soul rest in peace, because he hasn't rested yet. This tiff between government and the family, en route to the fact that it causes confusion even on the political landscape.
When history is written, at least up till now, Zambia will stand out as one of the African countries that has relatively conducted themselves in a decent way, passing power from one person to the other, different political parties, a good thing. And it is the normal thing that when a head of state or a former head of state passes and joins their ancestors, they are treated in a particular manner. There may be, as in some countries, a reserved place where such leaders are buried. But I've always taken the view that it is the family's position that must carry the day. It carried the day, and it has carried the day in many countries. Tanzania, Nyerere was buried in Butiama. When Nelson Mandela was buried in Unu. Moi was buried in Kabarak in his home. That does not mean that the burial will be dignified. So my prayer and hope is that there will be a rapprochement, and that the family of the late Edgar Chagwa Lungu will have their wishes implemented. That is the way it is. Ultimately, he was a father. He was a husband. He was a grandfather. That is the closest thing that you have before you become a president.
8 months before an election for Zambia, you've come obviously on a private visit, but this is one country that I know you cherish and have love for. When you pick news headlines and when you come into Lusaka with what is happening, what would be your observations or advices in terms of the political and economic situation? We are right now faced within an IMF restructuring program. Things quite hard in the way you described it. High taxation, restructuring in the mines. A few weeks ago, others would describe it as thuggery, but others would say it's discontent in the way young miners on the Copperbelt were treated, almost stoning the president. Others would say it's a vote of no confidence. There's this issue to have Bill 7, where the president is being advised, let it be more consultative, but let it come after an election. What are you seeing in Zambia from an observer standpoint?
It is always unwise to be very opinionated about circumstances and situations that you do not understand well. So my comments will be from a standpoint of somebody who does not have the total information. Let's say that the administration of President Hakainde came at a very difficult time for most African countries. You are reeling off COVID. You then have disasters like the Kariba, the hydroelectric power situation, which is a natural disaster, if you may. You then have an international economic order which is upside down. These factors conjoined made it, in my view, very difficult to fulfill some of the electoral promises that were made. And I saw it in Malawi with President Chakwera and many African countries, the inability of governments which come into power with good intention to fulfill the promises that they made, with the consequence that there is dissatisfaction. And I think that what ought to be recognized is that African countries are going through a very difficult situation. And whenever you see IMF and World Bank coming into your country, you should be very worried as an ordinary African, because they are not interested in the welfare of your country. We saw these with structural adjustment systems in the 1980s. Privatize, tax, reduce devalue your currency. Their prescriptions are known. Whether you are suffering from malaria or cancer, the medicine is the same. It is the duty of the administration in power, therefore, to ask the people to tighten their belts. But something is happening in Africa which must not be ignored. We have young populations which want jobs. They want opportunities. They want internet. And they are impatient. If you do not take care of their impatience, then they can run riot. And if you doubted me, look at what they did in Antananarivo in Madagascar. Every person joining politics must therefore be in a position to boldly tell the electorate, I'm going to do my best, but I'm not going to promise to bring heaven on earth. All of us will work together, hands on deck, to change our country. Let them vote you or deny you votes.
Finally, Professor, I mean, Africa is one that we would want to support to go democracy, but like you've said, in its own cultured manner. And coups rocked most parts of Africa, West Africa, especially. One does not support that. Now, coups and military rules, especially in West Africa. Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré has been making all these headlines, writing to the Pope, being invited to Russia. Others see him as Africa's new poster child of the new economic revolution. He argues that juntas are necessary because civilians have failed to govern. What's your take on what's happening with Traoré? He's now also trying to have a bite at the constitution. Is he going to stick to what he promised as a transitional leader?
This is not the first time that Africa has seen military leaders coming in as messiahs. We have had them. We had them in Silvanus Olympia 1963 overthrown. We had them when Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966, 1967, when Nnamdi Azikiwe and Boubacar Tafawa Balewa were overthrown in Nigeria. We had them in Idi Amin in 1971. The reason why people have appetite for this kind of change, as we have seen in the Sahel, it started with Guinea, Doumbouya. Then it went to Niger, Achiani. Then it went to Atimi Goita in Mali. Then it went to Touré in Burkina Faso, and we also saw it in Gabon. And people celebrated because civilian administrations have failed to deliver, and in those countries they were doing the bidding of France. But military juntas should be, as Nkrumah once said, if they are necessary, should be stopgap. Because leadership that does not emanate from national consensus is always under threat, internally and externally. So the things may be happening, but I am inclined to believe that the best way is for military leaders who come in for a short time to be midwives towards a more sustainable, institutionalized form of leadership.
Do you see this happening in Burkina Faso? Because even as things stand, not entirely that Traoré and his military, grouping are totally in control of Ouagadougou and the other parts in N'Djamena.
In fact, what has happened, not only in Burkina, even in Guinea, they have extended power. And we have seen in Gabon, the military ruler has now been elected as the president. In Guinea, Doumbouya is going to contest and he'll win the presidency. And in Mali, they have already extended the term of the junta. In Burkina, they have already extended the term of the junta for 5 years. And when you do that, then you are creating an environment which necessitates that others will try to remove you. So my own view is, it is an opportunity for these well-meaning people who have taken power through the barrel of the gun to use it for purposes of creating an enabling environment where power must be re-examined so that when there is a new dispensation, it is a different way of governance. I pray and hope that that will happen. A delegation that I ought to have been with only 2 weeks ago was in Ouagadougou. And these are some of the things that they discussed. I hope and pray that I'll be in Ouagadougou in the month of February next year. And if I'm given the opportunity, my view is, let us use this opportunity creatively to create a new dispensation for the sake of Africa, so that you are a good example of what is achievable. Because a little country like Burkina Faso or Mali or Niger or Guinea or Gabon cannot exist in spite of the rest of African countries.
In conclusion, Professor, away from, West Africa, probably the richest country on the continent is the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you've spent lots of hours and weeks and months doing interviews and commenting on this. Has Goma, has the East African Congo now come to a rest after Tshisekedi and Kagame meeting? Will Congo ever be at rest?
Somebody have said once, and I say this rather morbidly, that the spirit of Patrice Emery Lumumba appears never to have rested. Because since 1961, that country has known no peace, no quiet. The Mobutus came, the Kabilas came, and as we speak now, almost the eastern part of Congo is not under almost the whole of it is not under the control of the Kinshasa government. We saw the presence of Tshisekedi and Kagame at a meeting, and we thought that this had been midwifed. We have just seen the agreement that has been signed between the administration of Tshisekedi and the M23 in Doha. All these actions are good. But I think that the situation in Congo is so nuanced that it's not going to be easy to restore peace, because war and conflict has also become an economic enterprise for many players. But it's the duty of the international community, and particularly African, SADC and East African community, to stabilize Congo. It can be done, but it's not going to take a short time. There are no quick fix solution, no band-aid solutions, no instant coffee solution, no microwave solution, the way I see they are being bandied around. It is important that there is a long-term process of ensuring that this is achieved, no grandstanding. And I pray and hope that the agreement that have been entered into in Doha and the processes that we have seen, whether it is the Luanda process or the Nairobi process, all of them are conjoined with a view to rescuing that country, which paradoxically is the richest in the world in terms of mineral resources and is home to the poorest people in Africa and the world. It must be done.
Professor Philo Lumumba, thank you so much for having this discussion with us while you visit Zambia. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
God bless.
That wraps up the special interview on Costa. My guest has been Professor Philo Lumumba, the chairperson of the PLO Foundation, and obviously a legal scholar and an African think tank across the global and international community. Thank you so much for